For 70 years, the greatest minds in biblical scholarship asked the same question about the most important manuscripts ever discovered. They debated it in universities, argued over it in academic journals, built entire careers around answering it. The question was always, what do these texts say? Nobody thought to ask what they were made of. That oversight lasted 7 decades. It took a molecular biologist eating lunch with the wrong colleague on the right afternoon to finally ask the obvious question nobody in the field had considered. And when the answer came back from the laboratory, it did not just challenge one theory about one collection of ancient texts. It dismantled an entire framework that generations of scholars had treated as settled history. Here is what actually happened. Here is what the DNA said. And here is why the answer changes everything you thought you understood about the origins of Scripture itself. Chapter 1. The accident that started everything in the spring of 1947. A young Bedouin shepherd named Muhammad ed-Dib was doing something entirely ordinary. He was looking for a lost goat near the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea, in a stretch of the Judean wilderness that most people would cross quickly and never think about again. When he reached the face of a limestone cliff, he did what any bored teenager might do. He picked up a stone and threw it into a dark opening in the rock, just to see what would happen. He heard something shatter. What he had broken was a clay jar. What was inside that jar would become the single most consequential archaeological find of the 20th century. Between that afternoon in 1947 and the mid-1950s, excavations across 11 caves in the area near a site called Qumran recovered approximately 25,000 fragments representing close to 1,000 separate manuscripts. Among them were the oldest known copies of Genesis, Isaiah, and the Psalms, some dating back more than 2,000 years, predating any previously known Hebrew biblical manuscript by a full millennium. There were also sectarian texts, hymn collections, apocalyptic visions, and legal codes belonging to a religious community whose identity immediately became the central mystery of the entire discovery. The scrolls had outlasted the Roman Empire. They had outlasted every civilization that rose and fell above the caves while they lay sealed in darkness. They had been waiting, with extraordinary patience, for someone to find them. But when scholars finally opened them, the text did not deliver clean answers. They delivered a set of questions that would take the better part of a century even to begin addressing properly. And the most important question of all turned out to be one nobody thought to ask. Chapter 2. The theory that held for 7 decades. The dominant explanation arrived quickly and held almost without serious challenge for the next 70 years. Working from the ancient accounts of historians like Josephus and Pliny the Elder, scholars pointed to a Jewish sect called the Essenes, a community described in ancient sources as monastic, disciplined, devoted to scripture copying, and settled somewhere in the Judean wilderness near the Dead Sea. The ruins at Qumran, sitting just a short distance from the caves, seemed to match the description almost perfectly. The sectarian texts found among the scrolls described a self-contained religious community with its own leadership structure, its own strict legal code, and a solar calendar that placed it in direct theological opposition to the temple establishment in Jerusalem, the War Scroll, which described a final cosmic confrontation between the forces of light and the forces of darkness, read exactly like something a breakaway religious community would produce to explain its own exile from mainstream Jewish life. The pieces appeared to fit together with unusual neatness. The conclusion that took hold was this: the Essenes had lived at Qumran, copied their scriptures there, and when Roman legions crushed the Jewish revolt in 68 CC, they sealed their entire library inside the surrounding caves for safekeeping and were never able to return for it. That story was taught in seminaries. It appeared in museum exhibitions on every continent. It was repeated in documentary after documentary, textbook after textbook, for generations. The Dead Sea Scrolls were the Essenes' private archive. The question of origin was considered resolved. Pause here for a moment. Does it strike you as unusual that a discovery this significant, this complex, this ancient, could be considered fully explained within a few years of being found? Keep that thought, because the discomfort you feel about that is exactly the right instinct. Chapter 3. The cracks nobody could close beneath the confident surface of the Essene theory. Problems had been accumulating for decades. The scrolls showed a degree of textual diversity that was difficult to explain if they had all come from one tightly disciplined religious community. Multiple versions of the same biblical books sat side by side in the same caves. Different handwriting styles, different levels of scribal skill, and parchment quality that ranged from expertly prepared to rough and inconsistent were all jumbled together in ways that suggested multiple sources rather than a single production center. When radiocarbon dating was applied to a sample of fragments in the early 1990s, some scrolls dated to periods that predated the Qumran settlement itself. The chronology kept refusing to cooperate with the theory. Most puzzling of all was the Book of Jeremiah. Two substantially different versions of it existed among the scrolls. One resembled the familiar Hebrew Bible read in synagogues today. The other was noticeably shorter, with entire sections absent and chapters arranged in a completely different order. A rigidly uniform religious community, preserving two contradictory editions of one of its most sacred texts, made very little sense under any interpretation of the Essene hypothesis. But the tools available to scholars at the time could not resolve the question definitively. Handwriting comparisons are inherently subjective. Parchment analysis by visual inspection is imprecise. 70 years of brilliant scholarship had pushed the boundaries of what human eyes and human pattern recognition could determine, and then hit a wall. The breakthrough did not come from within biblical studies at all. Chapter 4: The Lunch That Changed History. In 2012, molecular biologist Oded Rechavi sat down for lunch at Tel Aviv University with biblical scholar Noam Mizrahi. The conversation drifted, as conversations between longtime colleagues often do, toward unsolved problems. Mizrahi laid out the core difficulty plainly: 25,000 fragments, no titles, no page numbers, no reliable physical method to connect one piece of parchment to another. The standard approach of matching fragments relied on handwriting comparisons and educated intuition methods that were subjective enough to be seriously wrong without anyone realizing it. Rechavi listened carefully. Then he asked one question: what are the scrolls actually made of? Parchment, Mizrahi said. Animal skin. Rechavi paused. Parchment has DNA. That single sentence opened an entirely new field of inquiry that nobody in 70 years of Dead Sea Scrolls scholarship had thought to pursue. Ancient DNA analysis had already transformed the study of human prehistory, tracing population migrations and kinship networks across tens of thousands of years. Rechavi realized, sitting at that table, that nobody had ever tried applying the same method to a manuscript, to scripture itself. What do you think would have happened to our understanding of the ancient world if that lunch conversation had never taken place? Leave your thoughts below, genuinely curious what people think about moments like that, where everything turns on a single accidental conversation. Chapter 5: Reading What Could Not Be Touched. The first obstacle was serious and non-negotiable. The Dead Sea Scrolls are sacred to multiple religious traditions and entirely irreplaceable as physical objects. Any method requiring cutting, drilling, or physical sampling of the parchment itself was completely off the table. The scrolls had to remain whole and untouched, so how do you extract genetic material from something you are absolutely forbidden to touch? The answer had been sitting quietly in plain sight for decades. Every storage box holding scroll fragments contained a fine layer of dust accumulated from decades of careful handling particles of ancient parchment that had shed naturally from the margins and worn edges of the fragments over time. That dust contained collagen, the structural protein found in animal skin, and locked inside that collagen, preserved across 2,000 years, was ancient genetic material. By collecting dust only from blank margins and areas where no writing existed, the team could gather enough material for analysis without ever contacting the inked text. The evidence had been accumulating silently in those storage containers through every decade of scholarly debate, waiting for someone to think to look for it. Extracting usable genetic sequences from that material was brutally demanding work. The process of making parchment in the ancient world, soaking, scraping, stretching, drying, degrades DNA severely at a molecular level. The iron-based inks used on many scrolls are chemically corrosive to organic material. After all of that, the fragments had spent 2 millennia in desert caves before being handled by hundreds of researchers across the following 70 years, each one potentially leaving traces of modern contamination behind. The team worked inside dedicated ancient DNA facilities resembling industrial clean rooms more than any archive. Full protective suits, controlled air pressure, ultraviolet sterilization protocols. They built strict authentication systems to confirm their results were genuinely ancient rather than modern contamination, running every sample through multiple independent extractions and cross-checking results between separate laboratories. It took years. It required hundreds of samples and repeated failure. But eventually, reliable genetic sequences emerged from dozens of fragments, and what those sequences showed stopped the team cold. Chapter 6: The Cow That Broke the Theory. Most results confirmed expectations. The majority of fragments came back as sheepskin, entirely consistent with ancient Judean agricultural practice. Because sheep and goats were the standard livestock of that desert region. Nothing surprising there, but a handful of fragments came back as something else entirely. Cowhide. Noam Mizrahi stared at that result for a long time before he said anything to anyone. He knew Qumran intimately, its texts, its terrain, its long and carefully studied history, and he understood immediately why that single data point was so destructive to the received theory. Qumran sits in one of the harshest environments on Earth. The Judean desert beside the Dead Sea receives almost no rainfall. The vegetation is sparse and tough. Sheep and goats can survive there because they evolved for exactly this kind of arid, minimal environment. Cattle cannot. A single adult cow requires dozens of gallons of fresh water daily and substantial grazing pasture to remain alive. There is no version of a community settled at Qumran that could have also raised cattle in any meaningful number nearby. The environment simply does not permit it, which meant that any scroll written on cowhide had originated somewhere else, somewhere with reliable water sources and actual grassland further north or west, in regions where cattle herding was genuinely viable. The cowhide fragments had traveled to Qumran. They had not been made there, and here is what made this finding even more significant than the obvious geographical impossibility. The cowhide was not distributed randomly across the collection. It clustered around specific texts. Specifically, it clustered around the shorter, differently arranged version of the Book of Jeremiah, the one that had puzzled scholars for decades. The longer version, the one resembling the standard Hebrew Bible, came back as sheepskin. Different animals, almost certainly different regions of ancient Judea, produced independently, by separate communities, maintaining separate textual traditions that they each considered authoritative. Two communities, two Bibles, both real, both ancient, both equally convinced they held the authentic text. Let that settle for a moment. What does it change for you personally to learn that the biblical text was never as settled or uniform as you were taught to believe? Chapter 7: Fingerprints in the Parchment. The genetic analysis opened a capability that had never before existed in the entire history of manuscript study. By comparing DNA markers across different parchment samples, researchers could now determine whether two separate fragments had come from the very same individual animal. Two pieces from a single sheep carry almost identical mitochondrial DNA. Two pieces from different sheep simply do not match. For 70 years, matching scroll fragments had relied entirely on handwriting comparison and educated guesswork. Now there were actual physical fingerprints written into the material itself, biological evidence independent of any human interpretation. The team applied this to the Songs of the Sabbath Sacrifice, a liturgical text describing angelic worship in a heavenly temple, with copies found at both Qumran and at Masada, the mountaintop fortress where Jewish rebels made their final stand against Rome in 73 C. The DNA showed that multiple Qumran fragments of this same text came from entirely different animals. This was not a tightly guarded, exclusive text belonging to one isolated sect. It was widely copied and independently produced across multiple communities in multiple locations. The kinship analysis went even further. By examining nuclear DNA markers, researchers could sometimes identify fragments made from closely related animals' siblings, or members of the same flock. Clusters of genetically related parchments pointed towards specific production centers, places where several scrolls had clearly been made from locally sourced animals within a narrow window of time. But those tightly related clusters kept appearing alongside fragments with no genetic relationship to them at all, parchments from entirely different animals, entirely different flocks, almost certainly from entirely different regions and different decades. The collection had not grown naturally from a single scriptorium attached to one community. It had been assembled from multiple points of origin, gathered across real geographic distance, representing communities spread across ancient Judea and spanning quite possibly more than a century of accumulation. Chapter 8: What the evidence actually reveals here is what this means when you step back far enough to see the whole picture. If the Dead Sea Scrolls had originated entirely from one isolated sect living at Qumran, their extraordinary diversity would be almost impossible to account for. Why would a single doctrinally uniform community preserve competing versions of its own most sacred texts? Why maintain multiple editions of Jeremiah representing contradictory textual traditions rather than simply committing to one and discarding the rest? But if the collection had instead been assembled from many different communities scattered across ancient Judea, contributed gradually over decades and possibly longer, and finally sealed away as a single catastrophic crisis approached. Suddenly, everything makes sense. The diversity is not an anomaly requiring explanation. It is the entire point of what the collection is. The evidence strongly supports a model that a minority of scholars had long proposed but could never prove, that these caves functioned as a geneza in Jewish law. Any document bearing the divine name cannot simply be destroyed or discarded, it must be respectfully preserved. Ancient Jewish communities maintained dedicated spaces called genezot for exactly this purpose, places where worn or damaged sacred texts could be retired with appropriate dignity. The geography fits this interpretation with uncomfortable precision. Jerusalem sits barely 20 miles from Qumran, a manageable journey by ancient standards. When Roman forces laid siege to the city beginning in 68 CE, Jewish communities fleeing that destruction could have carried whatever sacred manuscripts they were able to rescue into the wilderness, adding them to a sacred storage site that multiple communities had already been using for generations. Synagogue scrolls, family heirlooms, fragments of an entire world being carried out of a burning city by people who had nothing else left to save. These caves were not the private archive of one monastic order standing apart from history. They were a shared repository belonging to ancient Israel as a whole. And the cowhide fragments proved something specific about how texts moved within that world. Sacred writings were physically traveling between distant regions carried from wetter, more fertile areas into the heart of the Judean desert, not by a closed inward-facing sect guarding its own private doctrine, but by a living network of Jewish communities exchanging texts and religious ideas across real distance. Chapter 9. What this means for the origins of Scripture. The implications of this genetic evidence reach further than any single archaeological argument. The world in which Jesus taught, and in which the earliest Christian movement first took shape, was not a world of settled theological agreement. It was a landscape of active, geographically distributed religious debate, with multiple communities, each convinced they held the authentic inherited tradition. And critically, those communities were working from different versions of what they each called the Bible. There was no single universally accepted text of Jeremiah floating above the fray. There were multiple versions, shorter and longer, differently arranged, each treated as authoritative scripture by whichever community maintained it. The same pattern held for Genesis, for the Psalms, for the prophetic literature. Canonization was not a finished, divinely handed down process. It was still actively contested, still genuinely unsettled, at the very moment when the most consequential religious movement in human history was taking shape. The DNA proved that fact physically, not merely as a theoretical position in an academic debate. Separate communities in separate places were independently maintaining separate versions of what they each considered sacred. The scriptural tradition was not frozen or fixed. It was alive, evolving, and it looked meaningfully different depending on exactly where you stood within the ancient world. Every Bible on every shelf in every home today is, in some sense, one outcome of a contest that was still being actively fought when the Dead Sea Scrolls were being sealed into their caves. The evidence for that contest had been sitting quietly in dust at the bottom of a storage container the entire time, waiting for someone to finally ask the right question. Chapter 10. The questions that can now be asked. The 2020 publication of this research opened a chapter in Dead Sea Scrolls scholarship that is still being written. What it made possible to ask for the first time may ultimately matter even more than what it settled. Before this work began, there was simply no scientific method to confirm whether two fragments had come from the same manuscript, whether a given text had originated in one community or many, or whether separate scrolls shared any meaningful physical connection beyond surface similarities in handwriting or subject matter. Now there is. For the first time, the physical material itself can be cross-examined independently of any human interpretation of the text it carries. Researchers are already expanding DNA analysis across a much larger sample of fragments. They are pairing genetic data with multispectral imaging capable of recovering text invisible to the naked eye. They are building reference databases of ancient animal DNA drawn from across the wider ancient Near East, with the eventual goal of creating a geographic map precise enough that a single fragment might reveal approximately where, in the ancient world, the animal whose skin carries it once lived. The work of reading the Dead Sea Scrolls, in other words, is not finished. In a meaningful sense, it is only now genuinely beginning. If you are the kind of person who finds that idea as compelling as we do, the idea that the most famous manuscripts in the world still have secrets left to give up, then stay close, because we are going to keep following this story wherever it leads. Drop a comment telling us which part of this surprised you most. The community that grows around these questions is what makes continuing to dig into them worthwhile. And we read every single response. In 1947, a shepherd's thrown stone shattered a clay jar and let an ancient world speak again after 2,000 years of silence. In 2020, a geneticist extracted DNA from dust at the bottom of a storage container and heard something that 2,000 years of silence had been carefully protecting. 70 years of extraordinary scholarship had brought human understanding of these texts as far as human eyes and human pattern recognition could carry it. It took a completely different kind of question, from a completely different field of science, to carry it any further. The shepherd opened the door. The scientist, decades later, finally understood what had been waiting patiently on the other side of it. What no one expected was that the answer would not be written in the ink sitting on the surface of the parchment. It would be written in the skin itself, in the DNA of animals that died 2,000 years ago, whose hides were scraped and stretched and dried and written upon and sealed into clay jars in a cave above the Dead Sea, and who had been, all along, the silent witnesses to everything.